So everybody now, go onto Twitter, you sign up, and I'll be tweeting that in about, 25, 30 minutes, so hopefully give you some incentive to tweet. But first of all, I just have to say what an honor and a privilege it is to be here today. And I'm not just saying that because I work for Twitter. I'm saying that because I'm a startup guy, deep down. And I know what it's like when you're on that journey and you feel so lonely at so many points. And sometimes, like this time, when you get together and you understand that you're actually part of a family, of a kind of a global tribe of misunderstood people. People tell you, you're crazy. When I started my company, I left a great job. People thought I was having a nervous breakdown. And so when you get together in a room like this, and you can feel the sense of solidarity that stretches not just across different industries, but countries and continents. I think 63 countries represented at this amazing event over the past of these couple of days. So I want to say to you, first of all, do appreciate that for now. And I know you all probably pitching, but just take a moment at some point today or tomorrow and just to remind yourself you're part of this great big global movement. I'm going to tell you, first of all, what I'm not going to speak about before I talk to you about what I will speak about. The first thing is, I am here, I am the Vice President of Media for Twitter across this big region, Europe and the Middle East and Africa and, of course, Turkey, very importantly. But I'm not going to necessarily talk here for Twitter. In fact, I'm not going to talk on behalf of Twitter. What I want to do, first of all, just before I leave Twitter, as a subject, is just to say to you, one really important thing to understand about my presence here is that around the world today, innovation is taking place in places that maybe 5, 10 years would have been unlikely, if not impossible places for world-changing ideas to happen. I think there was a tendency for entrepreneurs like me from Europe to look to Silicon Valley always as the standard by which we had to judge ourselves. And I hope that you'll feel my presence here today, as someone from Twitter, is an indication that Silicon Valley is looking to the world. I'll give you an example, 79% of the users of my platform, of our platform called Twitter, are outside of the United States. There's a deep awareness, I think, in a technology company like ours, that it is an idea, potentially, from Istanbul, from my hometown of Dublin, Ireland, from Singapore, from Cairo, from Athens, that will be the next game-changing idea. And that's why it is so important that you have that confidence to know that you are part of, first of all, the most dynamic era for any entrepreneur. But secondly, the world is watching your ideas. And I think, for example, Silicon Valley particularly is conscious that in places where, for example, there's been economic crisis, like in Ireland, I just mentored a company from Greece, and we were talking about the idea that world-class innovation coming out of countries that have suffered recession is something remarkable, something we should value. The second thing I would say that I'm not going to talk about is I'm not going to talk to slides. You'll notice that I'm not going to use slides here today. I think at a conference like this, we see way too many PowerPoints. So let's just take a break for a few minutes from the PowerPoint, because I want to tell you a story, which is, I suppose, what all entrepreneurs want to do, is tell you a story. I want to tell you my own personal story. It's kind of unlikely in one way. It's how I became an entrepreneur. And from that story, I hope to talk to you about the mindset of an entrepreneur. Because the one thing I would want you to leave today from this hall is to understand that a startup is all in your brain as an entrepreneur. Your mental capacities to deal with the ups and downs of your journey are what will define your success or your failure. So I started out as a kid in a family of people who took risks. My father was definitely an entrepreneur, but I had a different dream. I wanted to be a political chat show host and a war correspondent. Basically, I wanted to be a journalist from the age of about 4 years old. I remember I was the precocious kid who ran after the newspaper before my father could get it. I was so interested in journalism, and I lived my dream. I worked for the Irish National Television station. I was a foreign correspondent. I was the Washington correspondent. I was a war correspondent, and finally I became a TV show host. I was the host of the primetime news show in Ireland. Very happy, very glamorous job. I get to travel around the world, many times coming to Turkey. and I had the dream job. But there was something I could see happening in the world that made me very uncomfortable. And everyone has a startup story the moment the light bulb went on above their head. And mine was, one night I was at a wedding in the west of Ireland by a very beautiful river on a very beautiful June evening. And I remember in the corner at the bar, all the kids, I call them kids, all those under 30 years old were gathered around their mobile phones. And I walked over and said, "What happened?" They said, "Michael Jackson's just died." "How do you know Michael Jackson's just died?" And they said, "Twitter just told us." I said, "What do you mean Twitter?" And I realized at that stage that these 25, 26-year-olds were getting news of something that hadn't broken in any reputable news organization. In fact, we heard the news at about 9:30 Irish time. By 10 o'clock, I was on the dance floor with my mother, dancing to Thriller, which is not a pretty sight, but it was a fun night. And it was 15 minutes later that the LA Times, the hometown newspaper for Michael Jackson, reported his death. So just imagine that. In a small, tiny town in the west of Ireland, because of Twitter, we heard about the news of this, the king of pop's death, about 45 minutes before his local newspaper reported the fact. So I suddenly realized as a journalist, I no longer could be a gatekeeper, somebody who delivered the facts to you, to a mass audience. Suddenly, Twitter was giving any person with access to their network and a mobile phone the capacity to be an eyewitness to history, to consume information firsthand from not just the source, but sometimes to be the source. And so that scared the hell out of me. Because as a journalist now, I suddenly thought to myself, wow, this is very, very uncomfortable. Now my job basically is over, right? Who needs me? It used to be that you had to have the satellite dish or a printing press or a radio transmitter. Now all you need is that phone and to be there at the scene. And so I thought to myself, well, that's a problem for me, but it's also a problem for the rest of the world. Because when everybody is telling a story, which story do you listen to? When there's so much content out there, which piece of content matters? Who's the trustworthy source? And how do you get quickly to the person who is that eyewitness? So I had this great idea. What if I, as a journalist, took, let's say, Reuters or the Associated Press, the big news agency, and I broke it apart, and I started from scratch in the social media era. So I couldn't get this idea out of my head for the next few months. I had this great job, and I suddenly thought to myself, you know what, in 25 years' time, I'm going to see my son. He was only 4 years old at the time, and he's going to say to me, "Dad, do you remember that great idea you had? What did you do about it?" And I couldn't bear the idea that I would look him in the eye and be embarrassed to say, I didn't do anything. And so this idea became like a virus inside me. I just had to do something about it. And 8 months after that fateful night where I heard about Michael Jackson, I informed my bosses that I was giving up my job to go and do a startup. And as I say, some people thought I was having a nervous breakdown. Some people have a midlife crisis. I was 39 and buy a new car or motorbike, but I was kind of going into the startup world. And I left, and I was so unprepared. I remember going in the very first day that I had this incubator, gave me a space, and I was on my own with a laptop and a whiteboard. And I went up and I mapped out my business plan on the whiteboard. And about halfway through, I realized I was using permanent marker. And I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to scrub off the permanent marker and think to myself, is this the way Jack Dorsey started out? Is this the way these great entrepreneurs start out? The answer is yes. I don't think anybody is prepared, no matter how well thought out their idea is, when you start out on this journey. Nobody really has an idea what you'll face. They say every great idea falls apart when it comes in contact with reality. I had no idea about balance sheets. I had no idea about term sheets. I had no idea about cash flow. I couldn't tell you about P&L. I thought P&L was like a early 80s rock band. I had no idea. And so I realized, first of all, you can learn things. You can learn about balance sheets, and you can learn very quickly about the nuts and bolts of what's a good presentation. You can learn about presentation to investors. I had the advantage, I was already a storyteller, which is the most important thing. I had a light bulb moment I could describe. But you have to realize that it's not those nuts and bolts that are important as you start out. It's how you as an individual, as a person with flaws and strengths, deal with those daily problems and daily opportunities, the excitement and the heartbreak that can happen within minutes of each other. That's what will define you as you go on your journey, not necessarily how good your PowerPoint is or how good your understanding is of a cap table. And so I went on and I had initially embarrassing experiences pitching. My idea was way too broad. I had to get critical feedback from people that I respected. It was really hard. But the company picked up momentum. And just let me share with you maybe a couple of lessons that I learned that I hope will in some ways trigger some recognition from you. And if you haven't thought about them, you're starting out in your journey, I hope maybe you'll keep them in the back of your mind. The first thing I realized was the role of fear. In some ways, a positive role that fear can play in the life of a startup, an entrepreneur. Because I remember, you're always tending as a startup person to think with the back of your brain. That's the place that you have your fight or flight mechanism, your paranoia, the feeling like you've got to hunker down and be defensive. And if you're living in that part of your brain, you're going to fail. You have to find a way to move yourself into the forward part of your brain, which is about optimism and the spirit of can-do and moving forward and taking a risk. And you've got to be okay with that. You've got to be okay with the risks. And so that journey, literally between one part of your brain and the other, is something that I felt deeply one night. And it was the day before, it was Christmas Eve of 2010, and I'd been in this journey for maybe a year. And I had that morning been offered an angel round of investment, my first round. My company was going out of business if I didn't get this. And so I was made the offer, should have made me very happy, but it didn't. And that Christmas Eve morning, I realized that the people that were giving me money didn't really get my idea. And I didn't really feel they were the right fit for my company. So I wrote the email back and said, thank you, but no. And my wife came to collect me. We were driving to the west of Ireland where my family live. And we were going for Christmas. And we got in the car, and it was snowing heavily. And I couldn't tell her, I was so embarrassed that my company was over. The dream that we had remortgaged our house for, we'd invested everything and we had. She had come with me on the journey. It was over. And it was only about, halfway through the journey as we emerged out of the snow that I took the courage up and I said, listen, I'm really sorry to say, I think the business is gone. She was okay. And as we discussed it, we realized, you know what? The worst thing can happen. I'll go back, get a job, we'll be okay. We'll get out beyond this, and I'll have done it. And I can tell my son in years to come that I tried. And at some point, I became almost intoxicated with the feeling of, I faced the fear. I faced the worst fear possible, which was that I would fail. And it was okay. It was okay. That was the moment of liberation for me as a startup guy, as an entrepreneur. I had faced my failure, and it wasn't that bad. And I had lots more fear. Don't believe me, for the next 4 years I feared a lot of stuff. But I knew the worst could happen wasn't that bad. So that was a liberation for me. From there on in, I really felt like I could relax, even when I felt defensive, that I could always feel like, well, you know what, this is worthwhile. I can take a risk, it's worthwhile. So facing your failure through a moment like that, I think, is one of the critical things that I learned. And because of that, I could take risks. I'd hire people. I got my investment from somebody who just gave me $100,000 over a cup of coffee because we talked and we had a bond. And I hired people. And the next thing I realized was that, I've been paranoid again about my lack of experience and my lack of strategic understanding of enterprise. And basically, I decided at that point, well, what's going to happen here is that I'm going to get people who are smarter than me. And I hired good people. But at some point, I realized there was something missing, and that was something called culture. Because when people came in, I realized some people weren't really getting the idea of my company. So the company that I founded was Storyful, and the idea was that we were going to verify and discover content that meant something to the world. We would hand that over then to news organizations, and we would support great quality journalism at a time of great change. And if you didn't believe in that, I didn't want you as part of the company. And I kind of hired people who had great skill sets but didn't really get that. So I worked very hard over the next year to sometimes let people go and say goodbye, we're not right together. Generally, it was a relief for them. But I started to build up a team. And I remember one day a developer came to me and I had some crazy idea, and he said to me, that's not very storyful. And I looked at him and I thought, wow, he's just summed up the culture of this company in one word. The culture had become a reality. People could speak to each other in this kind of shorthand. One word could sum us up. Not some long elevator pitch, not even a deck. One word. And that's what I would say, is when you know that happens in a company. When I was just at a pitch, and I'm going to murder this name, but the name of the company that pitched was Ashrak. And the entrepreneur said at the end about his team, this is about 20 minutes ago, he said, here's my Ashrakis, right? He had thought about the idea that these people were all united around a common goal, and it could be expressed in one word. It's a beautiful thing. Culture beats strategy. I know it's a cliche. It's a cliche because it's true. So my company went on. We hired great people. We started to get great contracts. We got a contract from another platform called YouTube. We basically got contracts from news organizations like the New York Times, BBC. We start working with the biggest and best news organizations in the world. We start working with brands because we realized that big brands want to connect with this user-generated content on the social web. And that was the real dangerous point, because I was confident. We were getting great contracts. And I was getting very, very sort of like we were going to take over the world. And that's a very dangerous place to be as an entrepreneur. Because I raised another round of funding. I bought free breakfast for people. I wanted to get the foosball table in. You've all seen the kind of startup culture we try mimic from California sometimes. Oh, bad mistake. Because what I realized was that I saw I had like 40,000 euro of orders every month. And I thought, wow, I've got 40,000 euro in the bank, which is not true. You got a 90-day payment terms. So actually, I was 3 months behind. I had no money. I had money coming in 3 months' time, but I had nothing to pay wages. And I had basically become so overconfident. I had let myself believe that success and traction is the most important thing when it's not. I had missed out the moving parts of my own business. I had not paid attention to detail because I got confident because of my early traction. And that was probably a defining moment for me, not just because I suddenly realized that in time, I didn't. The company was basically 6 days, away from going bankrupt, where we couldn't pay our staff. Frantically, I went back to my investors and had 6 days to try and get them to give me more money. 6 days before I had to stand up in front of the 30 people now that were part of the company and tell them I couldn't pay their wages, and I was so sorry. And that 6 days was very tough, 6 days, and finally it ended by the people giving me the money, the investors, but they told me I had to cut my staff. And they said 20%. 20% is a fraction. 20% is real people, one of whom was one of my best friends for 15 years. I had to go in one day and literally arrange seats in an order where I went sequentially to the people that I had to lay off and tell them, I'm sorry, but I made a mistake and the business needs to part company with you. And that was just that moment I realized that success is a danger sometimes and that you have to constantly keep in the back of your mind the attention to detail. And later that evening, I couldn't have felt worse. I had got the money from the investors, but I had lost 5 really good people. And that evening, as I'm leaving the office, and I'm thinking everybody hates me, they said to me, come on, let's go up to the bar. We're Irish, so that's kind of what we do at the end of the day, another cliche. But basically, we went there, and I didn't know why I was there. I just fired their friends. I had made a big mistake. And one guy at the end came up to me, and he said, he changed my life. I don't have to forget that. And this guy was actually comforting me at a moment when I felt so guilty. And again, it was partly because the culture was so strong in the company. They understood that we took risks together. And so I never, ever forgot that moment. I'm not proud of that at all. That was a failure, and I'm not proud of the fact that I had to lay these people off. But I am very proud of that moment that the company was strong enough, the culture was strong enough, we had created it together, that it sustained us. But I would never make that mistake again. Success is not your friend sometimes. Success is what breeds bad behavior, bad habits, which forces you to take the eye off the ball. So the corollary of that is failure. Failure is your friend in many cases. Because what failure is allowing you to do is learn. Now, I'm not in favor of failure. I'm not saying you should go out and fail. Failure is not a good thing, right? But you have to fail fast. That's the key. And I know, again, these are cliches. You've heard them before. But I remember that ability to be agile. I learned it from my developers because I wasn't a product person. I wasn't a technologist. But very quickly, I learned from the developers in my company about the concept of agile development, the Scrum, the idea of having very quick bursts in which you try something toward a general goal, and you fail, and you learn and have a retrospective, and you adjust your course, and you constantly learn. And I started to realize that the cliches I'd heard about fail fast, like there's a great quote from a great writer, an Irish writer called Samuel Beckett. He says in one place, he says, "Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better." And I've been quoting this for a long time, but that's when I suddenly realized what that meant. Was when you start to work with product developers, you start to realize that the whole basis on which technology is developed is around this concept of fast failure and creating structures that can work around it. And that was just such an eye-opener for me. And from there on in, it wasn't that I failed less, but it's just I realized that I could create a structure around that failure that could make the company faster and stronger. And if it hadn't been for that realization, my company would have been overtaken by huge competitors, potential people who were going to wipe us out. We would have been wiped out by other competition that emerged as well when they saw our idea and tried to do it better. And that's really the nature of innovation that I discovered. I also discovered about innovation at the same time that people tell you to think big. I don't think so. I think innovation is about thinking about the small things that when you add them up together sequentially in a sequence that's well planned, add up to something big. It's not about having some sort of rocket launch. It's about having this ability to very quickly iterate, change course, and listen to your customers and let them guide you on the journey. So again, thinking about the small things you can do to iterate becomes a manifesto for success, at least in my business. And one thing I would say in all of this is my sector, my media background may not work in other sectors, but I do think that is a universal truth. And so when I go further, we got very successful. We got to the point where we had small sales department, but we got we had no marketing. I built my entire business on Twitter. I got my content from Twitter. I hired all my senior executives through Twitter. I did my thought leadership, my marketing for free through Twitter. And what happened was I got basically people who would stay with me. And what I realized was that at that stage, you realize what you don't have. We didn't have a good sales force. We had great people on the editorial side. We had great people on the product side. And what I did was I kind of betrayed myself at that moment because I realized that I wasn't really that go-getting technology salesman guy. You know, I was the big picture, touchy-feely person who could go into a room, but I couldn't really close deals. That was my weakness. So I decided to hire someone that would kick doors down and go in and shout and scream and get that sale. And I betrayed my true values because that wasn't the value of my company. And I hired somebody, and again, for a second time, we came very close to falling off the cliff because we had hired somebody that very quickly became almost toxic, did not share the culture with the rest of the people. I had tried to overcompensate for my own weaknesses by hiring somebody that was contrary to my values and the values of the company. And for the second time, I had that hint of mortality in my startup. And that was what I learned as well. Be true to yourself. Be authentic. And at that stage, sometimes you'll find that to be authentic to yourself, you could give up, maybe have to give up. Because remember, the vast majority of startups will never reach an exit or the ultimate point of success. Vast majority of startups will fail. But as long as you do it fast and early enough, it doesn't have to be the end. It can be a beginning. But I've seen way too many people for years limping along, never really being true to themselves, pivoting, changing, trying to be something different. You know, I remember someone said to me once, it's like, you're not a microwave oven, you're a toaster, and remember that. Strange analogy, but it actually makes sense. Don't try to be something you're not, and that was another thing. And when you do find that you've got the idea and the idea is wrong or the execution's wrong, stop right there. Don't go further because there's nothing worse than limping along trying to be things you're not. But of course, I can say all this because my company was eventually acquired. And I remember at the end getting a phone call from somebody from a big media organization, News Corporation, owned by Rupert Murdoch. And one of the people that I respected most in this organization that I actually knew was a real innovator said, "Hey, what about investment from us?" I said, "That's actually interesting. We are raising money." And he said, "Well, the only problem is we don't take minority stakes." So I realized suddenly that this was a bid for my company. Problem was, people don't tell you that great companies can be killed off by potential exits. We took 8 months in which we had to get our CFO and our COO basically working full-time in a data room. We were getting, crazy requests to go back to the depreciation on the first 2 laptops we had back in 2011. It's that level of preparation. We had seen things in the tax structure, the way we had structured our share options, that at the very last minute had to be rectified. And I know this is going to sound strange, and to the people in the room who are urging, if you're investors or you're in incubators, I know you'll tell your people, don't think about an exit. You're not just here to make money. But sometimes it is a good thing. In my case, we didn't have the money or the expertise in certain areas, the scale of distribution, to outstrip the competitors that were coming onto the market. It was the right decision to sell. My company at sale had 90 people. Now it has 160. It's all over the world. Storyful is a huge success. It would not be there today if it weren't for the fact that I sold the company. So for some people, not for all, an exit is the right thing. So I would say to you, always think about the end point. When you start the company, be thinking about what success looks like. What is the exit that you want? And it may be that you continue on to become the unicorn, or it may be that you continue on to have a lifestyle. But whatever you do, be thinking about that. Future-proof everything. Decisions I was making in 2010, 2011, when it was me or just a couple of people, almost killed a deal that would be the right deal for me 4 years hence. So future-proofing, always think of the end is nigh, right? Everything you do could be a time bomb. And it's not just for exit, it can be for a massive round of funding. That will be the critical thing. If you have not paid attention to the detail at the beginning, then you could be in real trouble later on. And so for me personally, that's back to this concept of it's the small things. Pay attention to everything. Think small. Don't be thinking big necessarily, because you miss the things that will kill you in the end. And so I want to bring it to an end there. I talked longer than I thought. I wanted to ask for some questions if anyone had them. I may have a chance for maybe 1 or 2 questions. But I just wanted to share that with you, because one of the things I know from coming to conferences like this, I hope that I haven't sounded negative in any way. And I hope those of you who came in today get expert tips on Twitter. I'm not sharing them, I know. But I really do believe, for those of you in the audience who are starting on the journey, please think of some of these things in the back of your brain. They may not apply to you, but I wish that I had gone to conferences at some point in my early journey and heard people talk about what goes on in your brain as an entrepreneur. Because I have to say to you, it is more important than many of the practical things that you can learn from a mentor or from a book. And I will tell you, the mentor is probably the person who will zone in on this, who will watch you not making eye contact with somebody because you don't have the confidence, who will watch out when your board report for a month has one missing digit or the point is in the wrong place. These are the people that help you. I had a great mentor and kept emphasizing about the mental capacity, because in the end of the day, I've come out of my startup journey. It was successful. I'm now in a company where I'm helping people build big businesses on Twitter. But I'm also here with Twitter as well, because I understand the innovation that's required, not just to sustain a company like Twitter, but also to help the people that it helps. Think future. Think obviously small, because that's where innovation comes, but remember, in the end of the day, it is a mental game. And that can be the difference, in my experience, between success and failure. And I'll just end by saying, I wish you success, but don't be afraid of the failure part of the equation. Thank you. I think I'm out of time, but if anyone has a question, obviously I'll be around afterwards for a few minutes, but anyone have a question, not about Twitter, but anything I've asked? How many people here are entrepreneurs? How many people have been entrepreneurs several times? Wow. That's great. And can I ask anybody to shout out a question? What's your biggest mistake that you've made? Anyone make a really, because that's what I want to hear about, the mistakes you've learned from. What was that? This gentleman here. Losing focus. Anyone else? Big mistake. This gentleman here. Trying to do a lot of things at the one time. This gentleman here. That's a good one. Thinking that you know what the user wants and you don't know it. Team. The most important thing, right? And maybe 2 last ones if I have. That's just over here, this gentleman in the black t-shirt. Procrastinator, great. I'm not sure what I think about that one, but I know. Sorry. Okay, I just want to go to the back here. I'm not missing anybody. That gentleman there with the beard. Sorry? Time management. Great one. And this gentleman in the white t-shirt behind you, I'm sorry. Yeah? Wrong monetization model, okay. I just asked that question. I'll have one more, I'm sorry, here to hog the stage. Blue shirt, the gentleman?
Starting with a lot of overheads.
Starting with a lot of overheads, okay. And okay, one last question here. One last point. Sorry? Okay, all right. Well, listen, I've heard a lot of things, practical things, and I would stop it there. Just, if you're listening to all those questions, they are very practical things. But remember what they're about. They're about judgments, human judgments. And I would just say that in every decision you have to make about overheads or doing too much, which is a sign sometimes of lack of confidence in yourself, remember, it's all in the mind. That's where the answers to all these mistakes come, and learning from those failures to become better and achieve success. I'm going to leave it there, I promise, but I am fascinated, and I wish you success, and I also wish to see you on Twitter, okay? Anyone's problem, we'll sign you up, and we'll have a conversation, because that's what Twitter's about, is having that conversation. So thank you very much for your welcome here. Good luck.